Hello and welcome to cogX 2021. You are tuned into the Global Leaders stage here, and wherever you're tuning in from, whether you're watching live or whether you're catching up, you're very welcome. A special personal welcome to our guests here live in London. We're in King's Cross at the Aga Khan Centre. It's great to see you all, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you. This session is truly international. It's global. Our guests will be tuning in, I believe, from the United States. Very much looking forward to a conversation around the huge topic of monetary policy. Who's going to pay for it all is the heckle that always goes up when huge pledges, some of them heard this week, let's be honest, are made. And I think our guest is going to have an answer to that or two. Let me not steal any of our interviewers' thunder. I won't say anything else about Stephanie Kelton, but what I will say is something very briefly about our chair for this session. He's an entrepreneur, he's an investor, he's a writer, he is a speaker around the world, and frankly, investors, academics, politicians, change makers all around the globe read Exponential View, and he's the writer behind it. It tracks the changes to our society that technology is triggering. Frankly, he'd make a brilliant interviewee on any day of the year. But today he's asking the questions. Please give a warm cogX welcome to Azeem Azhar.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ollie. Hi, everyone. And hi, Stephanie. How are you? Good, good. Well, this is probably the first time pretty much that I've been out in 16 months. So barring a short jaunt last week. So if I do anything wrong, it's because I've forgotten how to behave in public. Now, coronavirus has delivered sort of a lot of shocks to us, but it's also delivered a vast monetary and fiscal stimulus, an enormous, I think the technical term that I use is a spenderama. Government is back, baby. And the specter of Milton Friedman and the supply-siders who've driven the economic and political agenda since the mid-1970s, when I was just so high, have seemingly been banished. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, at this moment of crisis, government is the solution, not the problem. But how do we get these sums to add up? And how do we square our previous orthodoxy with today's reality? Fortunately, there are champions, those with the theory, the argument, and the narrative to help us find our way, tackling the deficit myth and bringing a new monetary theory to the way that we look at this world. First among those, in my view, recognized as a standard bearer, someone who can step in at this point of the macroeconomic cycle and articulate a new narrative, is Stephanie Kelton, a professor at Stony Brook University in New York, the author of The Deficit Myth, and a former advisor to Bernie Sanders, everyone's favorite internet meme, amongst other things. Stephanie, what a pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for doing this, Azeem. It's great to be with you.
Well, we should perhaps start at the beginning of all of this, because we've come through for 40 years of a particular view of how monetary and fiscal policy interact, and therefore what the role of a government is. And you've told a story that looks slightly inverted to that view. Give us the headlines.
Okay, well, for the past many decades, we have mostly relied on, you mentioned two policy levers, right? Monetary policy and fiscal policy. And for a very long time, with few exceptions, the macroeconomic thinking was basically that the monetary policy lever is the only one you really need to pull. Like, this is what central banks do, that if you have independent, credible central banks, then it's best to just leave the tweaking of the economy to the central bank, and mostly they can adjust the interest rate up and down to keep the broader economy basically in balance. You get high levels of employment, low levels of inflation, a good economy. Fiscal policy, the other lever, which is what governments do, your Congress or parliaments, fiscal policy, changing government spending, changing taxes. That's something that you mostly don't need. Now, in a time of crisis, you have to sometimes pull the fiscal policy lever. We had, of course, a crisis in 2008, and fiscal policy stepped up and provided some support for the economy. Not much, not enough. But we went right back to relying on central banks. And now with coronavirus, we've had a very different response, much more ambitious and continued fiscal support. So this is the basic thinking that maybe, just maybe, we are arriving at a point where we understand that we've asked of central banks too much for too many years, and that what we are seeing now is a shift toward greater reliance. You said government is back, baby. So that's the fiscal response. And we'll see, whether we get continued use of fiscal policy and support for the economy going forward. And maybe there is some real shift in the policy toolkit taking place, where we're going to start using the fiscal, the F word.
The F word is back. Well, so if we play some of that back, the notion was that if you could provide stable prices and you get government out of the way, we went through the 1980s, a wave of privatizations of government, state-owned companies in the UK, for example, our gas service, our telecom service, that if you did that and you were able to provide business people a sense of price stability and a clear view of what was going to happen with interest rates in the future, entrepreneurs could do their bit. And in a way, that was the driving mentality behind Reagan's administration and Thatcher's administration. What changed? Was that recipe working in the first place, or did it just work for a while and it's now stopped working?
Well, some of the recipe works, and it works sometimes. So, this idea that, as you just described, what you really want to do is create the right economic atmosphere, right? You want to make it so that entrepreneurs, as you say, are willing to hire and invest and support, jobs in the economy. And that the way that you do that is that you get the regulatory system correct, you deregulate, right? Take barriers out of the way, that you cut taxes and provide these sort of incentives. And then the private sector will take over and produce a good economy for you. Now, there are certainly things you can do to deregulate industries that will cause private capital to pour in. If you make it possible for firms to come in and frack and do all sorts of, investment in producing, fossil fuel sort of investment, you can produce some boost in economic activity. But I think at the end of the day, what we're starting to figure out is that what really drives hiring and investment by the private sector is when you swamp businesses with customers. That what you need, right? Businesses don't hire and invest because you provide additional tax breaks or, you change the regulatory environment. You might get a little bit of uptake, but to support the economy, to really lay in place a foundation where businesses have expectations that the demand will be there for the goods and services they produce. And the reason the demand will be there is that you are protecting incomes, right? You are creating an economy that has enough jobs and has high income so that businesses have a reliable customer base. Then you've removed a lot of uncertainty. Now they're ready to go out and start hiring and investing.
So what's fascinating about the way you tell this story, and you're well recognized for your ability to tell fantastic stories, is that it makes me think of a number of the institutions that emerged around the Second World War and thereafter that helped Americans get mortgages and buy houses and kick off that boom, which did very well until it stopped doing well in the early 1970s. So when we look at these charts in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal of government spending, and everyone's got their straight rulers out because the line has to go all the way up vertically, the obvious question, and perhaps this is the magic of modern monetary theory, which you're so closely associated with, is who pays for that? And when is it paid for?
Well, I guess you're referring to the government, the increase in government spending.
That's right.
I mean, look, the bottom line is that our economy runs on sales. It's spending that drives and propels the economy. Think about GDP. What is our GDP? This is how most people think about, the health of the economy. Well, you think about the labor market and employment, but you think about GDP. GDP just tells you in aggregate how much total spending on goods and services takes place every year. So somebody has to spend or the output doesn't get sold. And if the output doesn't get sold, businesses don't have incentive to continue producing at that level. They lay off workers and the economy contracts. So, capitalism runs on sales. Spending makes the world go round. So who's doing much more spending in the current environment? And the answer is that governments have stepped up and they have spent more. But a lot of the spending has been designed so that it puts income into the hands of the unemployed. It supports the income and, for small businesses that were struggling. So it is all paid for. This is what I think people are missing. They think that there's something on the other side of this where you have to pay for it. The reality is it's all been paid for. Every unemployed person who received compensation, a little check to help them buy, that was paid for. Every small business who got help from the federal government received the money. It's paid for.
But there's still that orthodoxy, that challenge, which is that government has spent more than it's brought in tax revenues. National debt, government debts have risen, and the general belief has been, well, we've got to pay that all back at some point. You have an explanation as to why that is a sort of a muddle-headed conception.
Right. So when I just said that it's all been paid for, this is the problem with the current discourse, is that people do talk as if there has to be a reckoning on the other side of COVID, right? That's when we have to reckon with the debt. We have to figure out how to pay it back. I don't look at it that way at all. I think that what's happened is this. Governments have increased the amount of money that they have spent during the coronavirus relative to the amount of tax revenue. So deficits have widened. Remember, the deficit is just the difference between two numbers. One number is how many dollars or yen or pounds the government is spending into the economy, and the other number is how many dollars or yen or pounds the government is subtracting back out, mostly through taxation. So a government deficit is just a financial contribution. It's a deposit into some other part of the economy. What happens, though, when the government runs a deficit is that it matches up its deficit spending by selling these things called government bonds. And we call that borrowing. And we label the bonds the national debt or the public debt. And that's where everything starts to go haywire, because if the government spends 100 into the economy and only taxes 90 back out, it's put $10 somewhere in the economy. Now it comes along and it sells a US government bond, treasuries in our case. So the $10 comes out and a $10 bond replaces it. That's just interest-bearing currency. That's part of someone's financial wealth, part of their savings, right? So all of this stuff that the government has been doing is just augmenting the financial savings or wealth of the non-government part of the economy. You don't pay it back because it's already the money. It's already the money.
This is the, I'm just going to turn to the in-room audience. This is, for me, the most remarkable feature in the way that, Stephanie, you tell this piece. I have to hear it time and again and read it again because it is so counterintuitive. And yet in your book and in your various articles, it makes sense. So I will plug Stephanie's book. She's also kindly put it in the background for us as well, where you explain it very, very, very well. The US government, though, is a very particular beast. It is a currency issuer of, the most widely desired currency in the world. Can any government adopt this strategy, or are there constraints?
Well, if you're asking if there are constraints on different governments' capacities to spend, the answer is yes. So the US, you're quite right, has a unique position in that the US government can afford to buy whatever is both available and for sale in its own currency. And it turns out that most of the rest of the world is happy to produce things in exchange for the US dollar. That gives the government access to a very broad array of goods and services globally. But, you know, Japan is not the global reserve currency. You look at a country like Japan, Japanese government's been running large fiscal deficits for 3 decades. The debt to GDP ratio is about the largest in the world. The interest rate on 10-year government bonds is about 0.
Mm-hmm.
Inflation is far below the Bank of Japan's own 2% inflation target. The Australian government, the Canadian government, the British government, all are currency issuers, and each of them can afford to purchase whatever is available and for sale in the Australian dollar, in the yen, and the British pound, and so forth. Now, if you take a country like Italy, or a country like Ecuador, Ecuador is dollarized. They don't have a domestic currency. Mm-hmm. They use the US dollar. So there is a very different constraint in the case of a country that doesn't issue its own currency, like Italy gave up the lira.
Or the Eurozone being a great example, right? So this could apply to Germany as well.
It certainly does, yes. Yeah. And so if you abandon what we would call a sovereign currency, and effectively turn yourself into a currency using government, then your capacity, your fiscal capacity is constrained.
So let's turn to what happens if, as MMT sort of picks up steam. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Biden government suddenly has a set of ideas that look rather MMT-ish with their infrastructure plans, and the things that were announced at the G7 over the weekend also seem to align with the vision that you outline about government being able to spend on the right things. Is that what you have seen?
To some extent, okay, to some extent. I think that when President Biden came into office, what you got very quickly was a $1.9 trillion COVID rescue package, right? And that was sort of emergency spending. And that was the government simply committing almost $2 trillion of new spending without the hand-wringing that accompanies, you know, how will we pay for it and all that kind of stuff. They just committed the spending and out it goes. Now with the Build Back Better agenda, what you have are essentially 2 proposals. One is for the more physical infrastructure kind of stuff, roads and bridges and broadband and so forth. And the other is the human infrastructure, elder care and child care, education and all that stuff. So he is proposing massive increases, if you like, in spending, about $4 trillion, but rolled out really over 8 years. So it's not all that much on an annual basis, but he is trying to quote unquote pay for a lot of that spending by proposing new revenue, tax increases on corporations and the wealthiest people in this country. So, you know, it is deficit spending. And by his own admission, it is deficit spending because he wants to spend more over the next 8 years than he is proposing to raise in new revenue over the next 8 years. It's not exactly how one would go about this if you were very, very consistent with an MMT framework.
So if you were consistent with an MMT framework, how much would you be spending and what would you spend it on?
See, that's the interesting thing is that MMT doesn't come with a set of prepackaged policies. It's not like a package, a suite of investments that you hand to government and say, here, do this, this is MMT. That's not MMT. MMT is a framework. It's an analytic framework. So it helps you think through how much spending capacity, right, you can take advantage of, the fiscal space available to you. When do you need offsets? How much spending can you get away with? It's just low-hanging fruit, where you say, I don't have to offset this spending. I can commit to spending $2 or $3 trillion over the next 4 years without the need for the offsets, without the pay for. So look, I think that MMT economists largely agree that the kinds of things that are most beneficial to spend money on are investments in infrastructure, R&D, education. These are the kinds of things that boost the economy's longer term economic productivity and growth. So, the Biden administration is definitely lined up around those areas, but also with childcare and elder care. There are questions about national priorities and what kind of a society do you want to build.
Right. So you're talking about spending on things that we would traditionally think of as infrastructure and public goods, things that have sort of very positive externalities actually beyond the value that goes to the individual, which I think is quite interesting because I'm quite a simple person and I need to find sort of historical values. And I think about the Friedman monetarist era and how a set of other values and institutional frameworks emerged around that. So of course, Friedman is famous for his monetarism, which gave us sort of neoliberalism, which also gave us that sort of extreme trade, global trade framework. It also created the school of shareholder value, and so changed the way in which companies were run. So there was a sort of set of other institutions and value frameworks that emerged around this idea that came from the Chicago school. When you think about MMT, what are the analogous institutions or value frameworks that you would expect to create? I'll put it a different way. If you were to write 1,200 words in the New York Times in an op-ed that talked about the purpose of the economy or the purpose of a corporation, what would you give us in that?
Well, so the subtitle of the book is Modern Monetary Theory and Building an Economy for the People, or the People's Economy, right? So I think that broadly, what I would prefer to see is public policy oriented around serving the public interest, right? The public good. What is the public purpose? And, the fact that the Biden administration has put climate and investments in the kinds of things that are going to help us deal with our climate crisis into the infrastructure package and said, these are investments that are, that serve the public interest. This is public purpose spending. These are the kinds of things we want to drive forward. And to your point, we're not going to leave it up to the private sector. We can't afford to leave it up to the private sector. The federal government doesn't have to hold itself by the same standards as private sector when it comes to investment. They don't need a high rate of return on investment. They don't need to invest in things that are quote unquote profitable, right? There's an entirely different framework for governments when they decide where are we going to put public dollars and what are we going to invest in. Mm-hmm. And it's secure the public interest and the public good. But, I think that it's not really for the MMT economists per se to rank order priorities. It is for the people. MMT economists come in and show you what kind of a world is possible. And mm-hmm. then it's up to our elected officials acting on behalf of the people to make those investments.
Now, we have about 15 minutes left, and in about 5 minutes, I'm going to come for questions. Oh, but you know what? My friend Nico has put his hand up, so I'm going to ask him. So, Stephanie, the question from Nico is, the Bank of England and the Fed have issued a lot of bonds in the last year. Sorry, the government's issued the bonds, which are sitting on the bank's balance sheets. Should those bonds just sit there and never be paid back?
Well, once the central bank buys the government bonds, it's as if Treasury never issued them in the first place. So they are effectively retired. Now, it may be the case that the central bank intends to unwind, in which case the bonds would return to the non-government part of the economy. But the answer to the question is almost certainly that they should remain where they are.
Remain where they are. Now, I want to come back to my previous direction of travel, which was you're creating a lot of capacity for governments, and MMT as a theory is doing that. But as you rightly point out, it's not complete in the sense that it doesn't tell us what to do with that money. Where should we look for strong ideas about how that money should be well stewarded and spent well?
Look, so I wouldn't say that MMT is creating a lot of capacity, right? What we're doing is we're revealing the capacity that already exists. Remember, MMT doesn't give Congress or any government new power over the spending, over the public purse, let's say. They already have the power of the purse. So MMT is really about holding accountable governments for making judicious use of the fiscal space they have. And that's what your question is really aimed at. How should governments spend? And again, I think that, it comes back to recognizing that the goal ought to be public purpose spending, that it ought to be in the interest of advancing, improving public well-being. So you could easily take advantage of the power of the purse of fiscal space by doing massive tax cuts that are oriented at benefiting the people in society who are already doing phenomenally well, right? You can target the people at the top end of the income distribution and say, well, it's a trickle down, it's the supply side, these are the job creators, we're going to massively cut taxes, increase deficits, and this is why we're doing it. We're making the argument it's for the broader public good. Well, the sort of evidence is in, right? We've tried this for 30 plus years, you mentioned since Friedman, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So what is the Biden administration proposing? Instead of a top-down, trickle-down approach, it's bottom-up and middle out. And that's what he is saying. And I think that the investments we want to see are exactly that. Invest in people, investing in the unemployed, investing in industries that are going to help advance the breakthroughs in technology, green tech, right, that deal with climate change. We want to do something to deal with the inequities in our system with respect to healthcare and education. So,
yeah, won't someone think about the billionaires at these moments in time? I want to pick up on that question though. So I saw on your Twitter feed a few months ago a picture of your book next to another one of my favorite economists, Mariana Mazzucato's book. And Mariana has talked about, I'm one of those people who has favorite economists. And, they're all strangely women at the moment. That could be a separate discussion. But a copy of your book next to her book, and there seems to be sort of something in her theory of mission-oriented states that tells us a little bit of what we could do with this financial capacity that MMT has revealed. Do you see sort of mission-oriented economies sitting well with MMT?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see if I shift this way behind me, you will see her book. There's a little apple, and underneath the book, you will see a copy of Mariana's book. Yes, she talks about mission-oriented finance. And in the last chapter of my book, I talk about mission-oriented budgeting. So I'm really talking about public dollars, right? The use of public money to make those mission-oriented investments. But we recognize, the two of us are quite close, that there is enormous overlap between the way that she thinks about, and she'll talk about the need for patient money. She'll recognize that private businesses cannot bear losses the way the public sector can, that the public sector can take risks. It doesn't just have to pick winners, it's going to pick some losers, and that's okay. That's part of, that trial and error. That's how you reach breakthroughs. And so the government can come in, provide public money, help the private sector innovate, and that there are synergies here.
But we have to connect that to the political process, right? So when I hear this idea that government should be allowed to make mistakes, and Obama has not been forgiven for two things. One is the tan suit, and the other is Solyndra. And he lost less money on Solyndra than the average venture capitalist might do in sort of half a fund. What has to happen in the political narrative that for those sorts of errors to be allowed? Or, I look at the US and to some extent in the UK, but less so here because the government is so sort of strong and popular. I just wonder whether there's enough latitude for government to make mistakes, just as the private sector is allowed to make mistakes.
Well, I mean, look, the government provides grants for research, and we know that with vaccine development, for example, we had to put, significant sums of money into the hands of researchers and those developing vaccines, and not every initial effort at developing and sequencing and so forth paid off. We had some failures along the way, but now we have a safe, effective vaccine. And so I think that maybe the experience with COVID and vaccine is one way to remind the public that, this didn't happen on the first try.
Of course, the Moderna vaccine was the initial funding came from DARPA of $50 million back in 2011, 2012 sort of time. I mean, the reason we have that platform available to us is back to a government spend. But DARPA was a very different beast, right? Because DARPA is a $3 billion a year budget, of which it put 50 into the RNA platform. You're talking an MMT of trillions of dollars, right? So there's also a sense perhaps that there's a portfolio approach that's required when deploying this revealed capacity effectively.
Well, you might need trillions of dollars. You do, if you're talking about climate. If you're talking about, solving other problems in the economy, tens of millions may be sufficient. So the point of mission-oriented budgeting is to figure out what outcome you're after, and then to fit the budget to the end goal, rather than doing what we usually do, right? Which is to try to figure out how much money we're willing to spend first, and then nibble away at a problem. Say, well, I guess we can only address child poverty or climate or whatever the case is incrementally, because we have small sums to work with. MMT asks us to flip that, right? Decide where you want to end up and then fit the budget to the mission.
We're running to the last 4 or 5 minutes, and I would love to take some questions as well, please, gentlemen over there. So the question there is, how can you apply MMT to emerging economies which are attempting to maintain their own sovereign status but don't have the credibility in the financial markets as a sovereign in the way that the US has?
Well, okay, so the US didn't always have this either, right? And for some countries, this is a multi-decade long program. I mean, what you want, what any country should want, is as high a degree of monetary sovereignty as possible, because the more monetary sovereignty you have, the more policy space you have, right? Both with fiscal and monetary policy. So the more you can do using those policy levers to improve conditions domestically. So if you're a country that is, we talked about Ecuador earlier, right? If you've outright dollarized, then that is a long-term project. If you are a country that has your own local currency, but you're also heavily indebted in foreign currencies, that is a longer-term project, right? How do you wean yourself off of dependence on the rest of the world for financing, especially when a lot of the financing is due to the fact that you can't domestically source enough food to feed the population, energy, critical medicines and technologies. You need investments, right, in those industries to finally get the kind of claw back the policy space that you want to operate. So,
but briefly to come off on that point, which is that it did strike me that sense of monetary sovereignty sits slightly uneasily with the sort of global trade mantra that we've lived with for the last 30 to 40 years, because you're talking about not just sovereignty in currency issuance, but also perhaps in energy, which renewables will provide, perhaps also in food supplies. So how do you sit MMT against that idea of a free-floating tariffs at zero global trade economy?
Well, look, a lot of these countries, emerging market economies in particular, with lots of debt denominated in foreign currencies, are on a kind of treadmill. They're in a trap, and they are exploiting, right? They're extracting, let's say, oil from domestic sources in order to export, in order to earn the currency that they then turn back over to their creditors. And so they are developing countries that are never able to escape the developing phase and become developed economies. And so, that's very difficult. The wealthy countries in the world can play a very important role here in helping countries actually develop. I mean, look what we're doing with vaccines now. We could say to the rest of the world, we will help you finance the acquisition of vaccine by piling more debt on poor countries. Or we could say we're buying 500 million doses of vaccine and we are sending them to you. We could do the same for food. We could do the same sort of thing with wind turbines or solar panels. I mean, we can do kind of direct aid instead of always thinking in terms of financial aid and more debt.
Great, thank you. I've got a question from a gentleman in the back there. Yes. Okay, so the question is really back to the original concept of MMT, which is why does fiscal frugality, which applies to the home domestic budget, not apply in the case of a sovereign currency issuer?
Okay, well, the line in the sand that you want to draw is that between the issuer and the user. So I am a user of the US dollar. I cannot issue the currency. Private businesses all over this country are currency users. State and local governments are currency users. Mayors and governors can't issue the currency. Only the federal government, the United States of America, has the legal authority to issue the currency. And so, in fact, it was granted in the Constitution. The founders said, right, the government has the sole legal authority to issue the currency. If I could do it, I wouldn't need the federal government to top up my income during a COVID pandemic. If businesses could do it, they wouldn't need the federal government to provide bridge loans in the form of, payroll protection and so forth. If mayors and governors could do it, they wouldn't need grants from the federal government. So the key difference between the way the government has to operate its budget and the way the rest of us have to operate ours is that we're currency users who have to get the money before we can spend it, and the federal government, as the issuer, can spend money it does not have.
There's a gentleman over there. Yes, please. The gentleman was asking the question about whether the Federal Reserve and the government are actually, that they're actually different things, but you suggest conflating the two ideas together. So how should we think about these two different entities?
Okay, well, I don't think I'm conflating them. I think what I'm doing is recognizing that the central bank is the government's fiscal agent. So in the case of the US, if Congress writes a bill, the way we've done, these multi-trillion-dollar spending bills, when Congress writes that bill, it is effectively ordering up trillions of dollars that come from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has independence in the sense that Congress doesn't tell the Fed exactly what to do with the interest rate. Congress doesn't tell the Fed when to hike, when to lower. It doesn't tell the Fed what inflation rate to target. So the Fed has that kind of independence, but it is not independent of government, and it doesn't bounce government checks. The Federal Reserve doesn't say to Congress, once Congress appropriates the money, says we were going to spend 2.2 trillion, the Fed can't say, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. We're not going to be making those payments on your behalf. The government's job, the Federal Reserve's job is to carry out, in part their job, is to carry out all payments authorized by Congress on behalf of the U.S. Treasury.
Well, we're just out of time, so I'm going to need to bring us to wrap. Ollie is looking at me. Stephanie, thank you so much for bringing such clarity to this idea. There are many unorthodox twists to it, so I do recommend the book, The Deficit Myth, which you can pick up from the usual places. What I would say in terms of my own sort of summing up, there is a sense that we need some new ideas, and there is some new theory coming from you, which is wonderful. That theory also does need its supporters in the policy domain, and let's hope we will find some. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, we'll move on. It's cool. Thank you, Stephanie. Let me echo that, but also let's have another round of applause for the brilliant Azeem Azhar. Thank you, Azeem. Thank you, Stephanie.